Without further ado, I want to introduce Adrian. Adrian Healy is a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, whose work explores themes of urban and regional resilience. He focuses on the social and economic resilience of people and places to natural and man-made shocks, and his current research is exploring the concept of resilience in the context of water-stressed cities in sub-Saharan Africa. This combines experience in economic geography with insights from behavioral psychology and hydrogeology. Prior to joining Cardiff University, Adrian was director of a major pan-European policy consultancy specializing in regional economic development. So Adrian, take it away, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome to everybody. It's quite odd time to do this when you've only got 4 faces sitting up on a screen at any stage, so bear with me on this. As many of you know, I've just started a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship, which is looking at the resilience of cities in sub-Saharan Africa to water shocks. And today I'd like to consider just one aspect of that. It's a 7-year study, so to try to talk about everything would be a little challenging. But I don't just want to talk about my research itself. I also want to take a slightly wider perspective, which hopefully will serve as a basis for discussion later on in this session. So working out how all of this works, what I want to do is provide short provocation to facilitate discussion, but also to introduce the research that I'm undertaking through my fellowship. Firstly, though, why focus on urban in sub-Saharan Africa and urban water supplies? Well, one of the reasons for that is because it's in our cities and our towns that projected increases in demand for water are going to be greatest over the coming decades. That, to my mind, is a good reason to take the urban focus as a starting point, although that doesn't negate the importance of the rural dimension as well. What I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes is just briefly provide some background and context. What is this all about? Talk a little bit about urban water supplies in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, and then move on to think about the rise of what we might call a self-supply movement, where people start supplying or sourcing their own supplies of water, and the implications this might mean for water resilience. In terms of context itself, well, I'm sure everybody is familiar with the human right to water, that everyone is entitled to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic use. Of course, that water does not have to be provided directly to individual households by public piped networks or supply sources from there. And in many cases, public pipe networks only reach the community standpipes. They don't get to the household themselves. And in fact, the human right to water doesn't even require it to be delivered by a public system. It could be privately sourced as well. What this means is that even where piped water supplies do exist within cities, many people have to queue for their water. We've seen the pictures, we know what that means, but actually one of the challenges at the moment is that COVID-19 brings the issue of queuing and having to travel to access your water and to start relief. And it might, and there is some anecdotal evidence of this at the moment, start to increase pressure for personal water solutions, whereby people are accessing and bringing in supplies of water to their own households, rather than relying on community resources from there. When we traditionally look at water supplies within urban areas, often this is seen as an engineering challenge. But what I hope that I'll be able to demonstrate here, and we can take as part of our conversation later, is that it's also a challenge of finance, a governance challenge, a health challenge, an economic challenge, a social challenge, particularly in terms of the distribution of access to water, as well as an environmental challenge as well. Just as an aside, when we're thinking about COVID-19 and the advice to wash our hands on a very regular basis for at least 20 seconds. I think one of the telling statistics that one can find is how few households in sub-Saharan Africa, these are the countries on the right of the diagram, how few households have access to basic hand washing facilities at home. The need in these cities and these countries to actually move water to the house in order to simply wash hands can be quite a significant burden, and also a health risk as well. But to look at some of the background trends, that the wider context to this, before moving on. One of the important parts is that across Africa, we have a rapidly urbanizing population and demographic movement as well, from rural to urban areas. That can be seen across the whole of the continent at the moment. Dar es Salaam is one of the fastest growing cities. Lagos in Nigeria is also significantly expanding and is set to be one of the largest cities in Africa in the very near future. Alongside an urbanizing population, though, we also see rapidly expanding economic growth, although that growth is fragile and unequally distributed, and we wait to see what this global financial or economic shock is going to do to growth rates. But significantly, across Africa, we have perhaps what George Soros has described as the world's fastest growing middle class, with all the implications of what that enhanced income may mean. And whilst a lot of the growth is fragile, it is unequally distributed, most of that growth for the last 10 years, or for the last 3 years, has been significantly above what the UK has managed in terms of annual growth rates. And what we find that as economies grow and incomes rise, so too does the demand for water. Conversely, if there are shortages in the amount of water available, then economic growth is stunted and limited. At the same time, across many cities in sub-Saharan Africa, we find aging infrastructures, erratic supplies, and insufficient resources to meet water demand. Those aging infrastructure means there's a significant loss of water through leakage from pipes, for example. Erratic supplies, where there are power shortages, there's a lack of finance, lack of capital, means that water is not available 24 hours a day and is often, as is the case in Lagos, shut off for a week or 2 weeks at a time owing to power shortages. Resources, the actual water resource is also often insufficient. Surface water dams are not always available, not always appropriate, owing to the cost of construction, malaria risks, the high levels of evaporation in tropical areas or in arid areas. And that leads to a lot of pressure on groundwater, and again, an emphasis on individuals supplying their own sources of water. But amongst a lot of municipal engineers and city planners, the surface water engineering paradigm remains very strong. I'm not going to talk very much about climate change, as I think we're still waiting to see what the results of that might be. But changing rainfall patterns, the potential impacts on rural to urban movement of population are likely to enhance the challenges of the resilience of cities to existing water supplies, and the ability for the cities to actually rapidly increase their supplies to meet demand that may increase as a result of population movements. But what does this all mean for my work and thinking about the current urban water supplies in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, one aspect of this is to think about the urban drinking water ladder. I'm sure that most people are aware of this. This comes from the World Health Organization, UNICEF. And essentially the gold standard that we see here is in terms of what is called safely managed water supplies. And that's drinking water that's located on the premises, that's an improved water source, and is free from fecal and other priority chemical contamination. Significantly, to be a safely managed water supply, it does not have to be a public supply, and it doesn't have to be a piped supply either. Non-piped supplies such as boreholes or tube wells, protected wells and springs, rainwater, packaged water or delivered water could all count as safely managed if it was available on the premises and on demand at the time. What we also find, I'm going to have to move a few things around on here so I can see all of this on the screen, is that sources of drinking water can vary. In most cities and most countries, we find that piped water supplies are the majority of the resource available. But actually, in some countries, these are the ones to the left of the diagram, non-piped water supplies are actually more prevalent. Equally, though, the urban population with access to piped water supplies on their premises, and I think this is an important element, has been declining over recent decades. It's gone down from 43% in 1990 to just 33% in 2015. That's partly due to the aging infrastructures, but it's very significantly due to the rapidly expanding population that we've seen within sub-Saharan Africa and the cities there. The reason I've got these slightly wobbly lines ringing certain countries is that those are the ones that my work is looking at over the coming years. However, where the data starts to get a little bit sketchy is when we start thinking about what the water supplies are when we move away from piped public water supplies. And those non-piped water supplies, they can include groundwater, which could be the boreholes, as I mentioned. It could be packaged water, or it could be other sources such as rainwater harvesting. And I've just taken here just 15 of the countries whereby you've got a non-piped water used by more than 25% of the population. Again, you can start to see how things differ by different countries, the importance of packaged water in places like Ghana and Nigeria, the importance of groundwater in a number of the countries there as well. One of the challenges, though, is that we have to compile these data sets from existing surveys. The data that we actually have from UNICEF and from the World Health Organization is really determined by the nature of what, or the notion of what is a human right to water. And that is about making sure there is sufficient water for personal and domestic use, which is safe, acceptable, affordable, and physically accessible. And we can see that three of those terms have definitions. Sufficient water, as you'll know, is between 50 and 100 litres of water per person per day. Affordable is that water cost should not exceed 3% of household income. And that physically accessible is that the water source has to be within 1,000 metres of the home, and the collection time should not exceed 30 minutes. These sorts of definitions start to drive the way that the data is collected and what people are looking at. However, there is an important question as to whether this is the same definition that households themselves would adopt as to what is affordable, what is safe, what is acceptable, and what is sufficient. It's noticeable that the definition of safe water is largely one which is based upon the chemical composition of the water. Is it actually safe to drink? It doesn't actually talk about whether it is safe to collect, for example. It doesn't talk about whether there is a fear of violence, whether there is fear of leaving one's house in order to collect that water. In the current pandemic around COVID, that takes on a new emphasis, a new importance, as people worry about queuing for water where they have to collect their sources from there. The question is also whether it's a trusted resource, whether it's a reliable resource that people feel that they can rely upon. And again, what is that question of accessible? For many, they would argue that 1,000 meters is rather a long way away, and actually they want to see a source which is much more accessible than that. So what we begin to see in many cities is an increasing incidence of self-supply, where individuals, households, companies start to take responsibility for sourcing their own water resources. That might be in terms of bottled water for drinking, but increasingly it's also we can see the sinking of boreholes or more shallow wells to provide personal water supplies. There is a limited amount of rainwater harvesting, but that's not particularly prevalent at the current time. We can see this happening at the domestic level, but also amongst companies and industries and for municipal users such as hospitals and schools and other educational facilities such as universities. It's this rising trend of increasing self-supply, which have set out the key themes of my research at the moment. And that research is asking what happens when trust in public water supplies break down. What is it that influences individual actions to source their own water supplies? Some of this is about the availability of water, such as the nature of the groundwater resource and the access to that. But some of it is also about the narrative, the framing narrative, which is prevalent around individual action to source water. Is this seen to be a perfectly natural, normal thing to do, something which is socially acceptable, or is it seen as something which is socially unacceptable? My work's also asking questions about what are the spillovers, the result from the aggregate effects of these individual decision taking, and how those effects might be managed, important questions about governance. So those might be issues around the availability, the quantity, the quality of the resource itself, or it could be an economic spillover as well. What we saw in Cape Town during the water shortages there, 2018-19, were the issues that people reduced their water usage, which reduced the amount of money coming into the municipality, as the municipality's budget is based upon, primarily based upon, the sale of water and the sale of electricity, reducing the amount of water available, and that led to them having to actually increase their water charges in order to recoup their revenue. And then finally, the question is about how these individual decisions seeking to secure an individual's own resilience affects the collective resilience of communities and of places. So I suppose that provides me with a number of questions that I'm trying to tackle around this question of emerging self-supply trends. As I've said, it's looking primarily at the factors which are driving people to seek to enhance their individual water security, although that does have an economic and potentially a social cost to the households and firms themselves. But more importantly, it's asking questions about the collective implications of this. Perhaps these are positive implications. It's to reduce the potential for conflict within a city. It's enhanced economic growth. But equally, there may be negative consequences as well, where you have negative spillovers occurring. So some of the things that I'm asking questions around is around the resilience of the groundwater resource itself, around whether there are falling water tables, possibility of surface deformation, whether there are environmental costs associated with this. Asking questions about the water quality and the potential for contamination of water supplies. There are important questions as well around the distributional dynamics which are at play. Is this simply a question of individual security for those who can afford it? Does it provide challenges for the urban poor, particularly as there may be a reduction in cross subsidies, which many public networks rely upon? There are questions, I've said, around the economic implications, both in terms of possible lost growth, but also in terms of municipal incomes and the implications of that for expenditure on other priorities such as health or schooling. And fundamentally, there are important governance questions, particularly where there's limited monitoring or regulation of common pool resources such as aquifers and groundwater reserves. So what's next for my work? And I'm going to finish at this point. Well, as I've said, my project is looking at 4 cities: Cape Town in South Africa, Dodoma in Tanzania, Lagos in Nigeria, and Windhoek in Namibia. All of them have slightly different problems and challenges. Cape Town, we understand the issues of the recent water drought, or the recent drought. That raises important questions about how people's framing narratives have changed. Dodoma is the new capital of Tanzania. It's a population of about 450,000 people. It has very good water supplies at the moment, supplied from an aquifer to the north of the city. But there are suggestions that the rapid population increase and the economic growth that's now forecast over the coming years, the water supplies won't quite be sufficient to meet that demand. There are questions then about where additional water supplies might be sourced from and the extent to which individuals might start to undertake actions on their own behalf. Lagos, less than 20% of the population has access to public pipe water supplies. There we see a very strong movement to people commissioning their own boreholes, which has significant potential implications for water quality and ground level resources. And finally, in Windhoek, again, this is a fairly well supplied city with a well managed public water supply. However, again, like Dodoma, well, no, not quite like Dodoma. Here, the issue is that known water reserves are quickly being exhausted. With further increases in population, there are real challenges as to where the water supply might come from. To look at some of the issues raised, the social, the economic, the hydrogeological questions, the behavioral dimensions, I have 5 key tools that I'll be looking at from here. One will be quantitative household surveys repeated at a number of points over the next 7 years. Qualitative work then with households and with firms, focus groups and stakeholder interviews, social media analytics to try to understand how people are discussing water challenges within the cities, and finally an analysis of the groundwater resource. I'm not going to go into any of those at the moment. Hopefully at some point in the next 2, 3 or 4 years, I'll get invited back to tell you some of the results of some of this work. So on that note, it's been a fairly rapid run through of the work that I'm doing at the moment, but hopefully it gives an indication of where the project is going. But more importantly, I hope it provides some fruits or some material for discussion for the breakout sessions to think about some of the important issues which are facing our cities within sub-Saharan Africa, and how our work might relate to that, to answering some of the pertinent questions coming forward. Thank you.